The Call of the Sea. The year was 1628, and the air in Amsterdam carried a restless hum. The streets smelled of tar, fish, and the sweet rot of spilled ale. Merchants shouted from crowded stalls, their voices competing with the hammering of shipwrights, along the wharves of the bustling harbor. It was here, among the creaking masts of the Dutch East India Company's fleet, that Jan van der Meer, a young man of 19, stood staring at the endless horizon. His clothes were worn, his stomach empty, but his eyes carried the same flicker of hunger that had driven thousands before him. Hunger not just for bread, but for something greater, something beyond the narrow alleys of his birth. Life in the Dutch Republic was not as golden as the tales claimed. The Republic may have been the richest trading nation in Europe, but wealth lay in the hands of merchants, regents, and shipowners, not in those of farmers' sons. Jan's father had died in a peat bog accident when Jan was 12, leaving him with little more than a bitter mother and younger siblings to feed. By 19, his hands were already calloused from hauling barrels and his lungs scarred from the damp air of the canals. For men like him, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, was both a curse and a promise. The company recruiters painted it as a door to fortune. "Sail with us to the east," they boasted in the taverns, their voices heavy with promise. "And return with pockets full of silver, your chest heavy with spices, your name remembered in your village." Yet the whispers told another story. Half of those who left never came back. Disease, storms, starvation, and battles, with Portuguese, Spanish, or native rulers, claimed countless lives, but the recruiters knew their audience well. Hunger could silence doubt, and desperation could sweeten the sound of danger. Jan had wrestled with his choice for weeks. He had watched his mother's back bend lower as she scrubbed linens for wealthier neighbors. He had seen his younger brother beg for bread outside the church. And when a recruiter placed a contract in front of him in a candle-lit tavern, the ink smelling of oak gall and finality, Jan pressed his thumb to the page. His heart pounded not with joy, but with something darker, the mix of fear and resolve that comes only when a man throws himself into fate's hands. That very night, he dreamt of ships. He dreamt of towering sails stretched taut like the wings of angels and seas that glowed silver under the moon. But he also dreamt of shadows, hulking waves, faceless men coughing in the dark, and a noose swaying in the salt wind. The morning of departure came with a chill mist rising from the harbor. Families crowded the docks, their faces pale with sorrow, their cries muffled by the crashing of waves. Mothers clutched their sons, wives pressed handkerchiefs into the palms of trembling husbands. The dock smelled of grief and hope mingled together. Jan's mother did not come. She could not bear to watch another child slip from her life. Only his younger brother, Peter, stood on the wharf, his small hands clutching a wooden toy carved in the shape of a ship. "Bring it back," Peter whispered, pressing the toy into Jan's palm. His voice cracked, though he tried to sound brave. Jan nodded, unable to speak, for his throat was tight. He tucked the toy into his coat and turned toward the looming vessel. The ship he boarded was called the Batavia, a newly built East Indiaman, with decks broad enough to carry hundreds of men, soldiers, merchants, and sailors. Its belly was filled with cannon, its decks stacked with muskets, and its holds crammed with barrels of salted meat, hardtack, beer, and water that already tasted stale. The sails, white as bone, snapped in the morning wind, and the Dutch flag fluttered from the stern like a proud boast. But grandeur was a mask. Below deck, Jan was shoved into a space barely larger than a coffin, where hammocks swayed like rotten fruit, and the air was thick with sweat, smoke, and fear. Rats darted between barrels, their eyes glinting. The stench of tar and urine burned his nostrils. He had barely set his sea chest down when an older sailor, a scarred man with teeth missing, laughed bitterly. "First time, boy," the sailor croaked. "Enjoy the smell. By the time we reach the Cape, you'll either be dead or you won't notice it anymore." Jan forced himself not to flinch. He had made his choice. The sea was no longer a dream. It was his prison, his battlefield, his teacher. That night, as the Batavia drifted out of Amsterdam's harbor, the city's lights fading into mist, Jan stood on deck. The wind tore at his hair, the waves licked hungrily at the hull, and the voices of the other sailors rose in rough shanties. He clutched Peter's toy ship in his hand. For the first time, the young man understood the enormity of his journey. He was leaving behind not only family and land, but a world he would never see in the same light again. Ahead lay storms, hunger, the lash of officers, and perhaps riches, or death in some distant, nameless sea. And yet, as the horizon swallowed the last flicker of Amsterdam's church spires, a strange fire rose in his chest. Terror and hope intertwined. The call of the sea was not gentle. It was brutal, merciless, but irresistible. Jan van der Meer, farmer's son, pauper's child, was now a sailor of the Dutch East India Company. His story had only just begun. Boarding the ship, the Batavia creaked like a restless beast as the tide carried her away from Amsterdam's harbor. The cheers and sobs of those left behind faded into the mist, replaced by the groaning of timbers, the snapping of ropes, and the heavy thud of boots against the deck. For Jan van der Meer, the moment he stepped fully aboard, he crossed an invisible line between two worlds, the familiar earthbound life of the Dutch Republic and the merciless, floating world of the sea. The sailors who had served before him called this moment a man's rebirth. The ship became mother, father, prison, and coffin all at once. The first lesson Jan learned was that space itself vanished. Below deck, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, hammocks swaying above barrels of salted pork, casks of ale, and the creak of rats gnawing at wooden planks. The air grew thick, foul, and already tasted of disease. Jan tried to find his place among the men. Some were hardened sailors, their faces lined with salt and scars, speaking in dialects he barely understood. Frisian, Zeelandic, Low Saxon. Others were like him, farmers' sons, blacksmiths, or beggars who had signed their name or their thumbprint onto a contract they could not read. There were also soldiers bound for Batavia, merchants with powdered wigs who kept to the upper decks, and cooks already cursing the dwindling barrels of onions. "Move fast, boy," barked the boatswain, a towering man with a whip coiled at his hip. His voice cut through the salty wind. "This is no tavern. When I shout, you run, or you'll taste the rope before your supper." Jan stumbled forward, clutching Peter's toy ship in his pocket, and scrambled to obey. The daily grind. The routine of life aboard the VOC vessel began immediately. Jan was assigned to the lowest duties, hauling water buckets, scrubbing the deck, until his knees bled, and pumping the bilge to keep the sea from flooding their wooden prison. The days were measured not in hours, but in the changing of the watches. Bells struck, ropes were hauled, sails adjusted, and the endless horizon rolled before them. But no task was more humiliating than the ritual of learning discipline. The boatswain, with his whip always in sight, reminded the men that the company did not tolerate disobedience. A man caught stealing food had his ear nailed to the mast. A man who disobeyed a direct order faced the keel hauling, dragged beneath the ship's barnacle-encrusted hull until his skin tore open. Jan saw this terror firsthand within the first week. A sailor, drunk on smuggled brandy, had insulted an officer. The punishment came swiftly. Before the eyes of the crew, the man was lashed to a rope, dragged under the Batavia, and hauled out again with his body shredded and his eyes lifeless. His corpse was tossed into the sea, and the sharks followed in their wake for days. The older sailors told Jan this was the way of the VOC. Better to fear the rope than to test it. Storms and shadows. As the Batavia sailed farther into the North Sea, the weather turned cruel. Black clouds rolled like armies across the sky, and the wind howled through the rigging like demons in a cathedral. Jan's stomach churned with every rise and fall of the waves, and soon the deck was a battlefield of vomit, seawater, and men crawling to the rails in misery. Seasickness became the great equalizer. Even merchants clutching lace handkerchiefs staggered like beggars. At night, when his watch was over, Jan lay in his hammock, clutching the wooden toy ship, and listened to the groans of the hull. The sea spoke in strange voices, the low rumble of waves, the shrieks of gulls following their wake, and sometimes, when the wind died, the eerie silence that made men whisper of sea spirits. Superstition ruled the lower decks. Sailors carved charms into the wood, muttered prayers before the mast, and cursed anyone who whistled, for they believed it summoned storms. One night, an old sailor leaned close to Jan, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "Mark my words, boy, the sea takes what it wants. Rich or poor, sinner or saint, it makes no difference. If she lets you live, it's only because she's not hungry yet." Jan shivered, though he tried to hide it. He wanted to believe he was stronger, braver, but deep in his chest, he felt the truth of those words. Brotherhood, in misery, despite the fear, friendships began to grow. Jan found himself drawn to Matthias, a broad-shouldered baker's son from Rotterdam, with a booming laugh that cut through the gloom. Matthias taught him how to tie proper knots, how to climb the rigging without breaking his neck, and how to snatch extra scraps from the cook's pot without being caught. Rule 1. Matthias grinned one evening, handing Jan a hunk of half-burned bread. "Never starve if you can help it. The company feeds you like a rat, but if you've got sharp eyes, you can live like a man." There was also Klaus, a wiry boy younger than Jan, whose fingers moved like lightning when mending sails. Klaus spoke little, but his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had already seen too much of the world. When Jan asked about his family, Klaus only shook his head. "Dead," he whispered. "All dead." These scraps of fellowship mattered. They were the thread that kept Jan from unraveling entirely. In the face of lashings, storms, and disease, the sailors learned to share laughter when they could, and silence when they must. First blood weeks into the voyage, trouble struck. A fight broke out below deck between two men, one Dutch, one German, over a stolen piece of dried fish. The quarrel escalated into knives. By the time officers rushed in, the German lay bleeding, his throat cut. The company wasted no time. Justice aboard was swift and merciless. The Dutchman who struck the fatal blow was dragged above deck, bound hand and foot, and shoved toward the sea. "By order of the VOC," the captain declared, his voice cold as steel, "the punishment for murder is death. May God have mercy on your soul." Without ceremony, the man was hurled into the waves. His screams were swallowed by the ocean, his flailing body vanishing beneath the foam. The crew stood in grim silence. Jan could not tear his eyes from the spot where the man had disappeared. He realized then that the ocean was not just their road. It was their graveyard. Jan's awakening. As the Batavia pressed on, Jan's body hardened. His hands blistered from ropes, his back ached from endless hauling, and his lungs filled with the sting of salt air. But something else grew in him as well. The boy who had left Amsterdam with trembling hands began to carry himself with a new weight. Each sunrise over the horizon was a reminder that he was still alive, that he had survived one more night in a world designed to kill him. Fear remained, but it was no longer the master of his heart. The sea had begun to shape him. One night, standing alone on the deck beneath a blanket of stars brighter than he had ever seen on land, Jan felt something stir deep within. The sky seemed endless, the sea eternal, and he, one small sailor, was caught between them. And yet, For the first time, he felt not only fear, but belonging. He whispered into the wind, as though Peter could hear him across the leagues of water, "I will come back. I will not let this sea take me." The waves gave no answer, only their eternal roar. Across treacherous waters, the Batavia pressed southward, away from the familiar coasts of Europe, into seas that sailors called the graveyard of fools. For weeks, nothing but endless gray water stretched in every direction. The horizon became a prison wall, the sky a dome that shifted from violent storms to blistering sun, and the ship itself a fragile coffin of wood and tar. For Jan van der Meer, time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the tolling of bells, the change of the watch, and the groaning of men in the hammocks around him. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, thirst cracked their lips, and the sea tested their resolve with each passing wave. The storm. The first true storm struck without mercy. Clouds gathered like armies of black giants rolling across the sky until even midday felt like dusk. The wind rose, howling through the rigging like a chorus of demons, snapping ropes and tearing at sails. "Reef the topsails!" The boatswain bellowed, his voice drowned in the chaos. Jan clambered up the rigging, his body trembling as rain lashed against him like whips. The mast swayed beneath his hands, groaning under the force of the storm. Lightning split the sky, white and furious, illuminating faces twisted in terror. Below, waves rose like mountains, crashing against the hull with the fury of 1,000 hammers. One slip, one mistake, and a man would vanish into the abyss. Jan saw it happen. A sailor clinging desperately to a rope lost his grip as the ship lurched. His scream was cut short by the ocean's roar, his body swallowed whole by the churning dark. For hours they battled the storm. Men pumped the bilge to keep water from flooding the holds, others lashed themselves to the deck as waves swept across, dragging barrels, ropes, and unlucky men into the sea. Jan's arms burned, his lungs ached, but something fierce kept him, clinging on. Survival was no longer a thought. It was instinct. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the Batavia scarred but afloat. Dead men were missing from the hammocks, their belongings already divided among the living. Jan stood shivering on the deck, salt crusting his skin, his hands bleeding from the ropes. He whispered a prayer, though he was not sure if it was gratitude or despair. Hunger and scurvy. After the storm came silence, and with it, hunger. The fresh food they had brought from Amsterdam was long gone. Onions and cabbage, the only guard against disease, had rotted in the damp holds. Now the sailors gnawed on hardtack, a bread so hard it cracked teeth, crawling with weevils that men swallowed without complaint. The salted pork reeked of brine and decay, the beer had turned sour, and the water in the casks stank of mold. Disease came creeping like a shadow. Scurvy, the sailor's plague, began to show its face. Gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened, wounds refused to heal. Men's legs ballooned, and their bodies wasted away. Some grew so weak they could no longer climb the rigging or pump the bilge. They lay in hammocks, moaning, their bodies yellowing like parchment. John watched Matthias, once full of laughter, struggle to chew a piece of pork with bleeding gums. His friend spat blood into the scuppers and forced a grin. "Better than starving, eh, Jan?" he croaked. But Jan saw the truth. Each day, Matthias grew thinner. Each night, more hammocks swung empty. Mutters of rebellion desperation bred whispers. Below deck in the shadows, men muttered about the officers who ate better food, drank better beer, and seemed untouched by the suffering of common sailors. Rumors spread like fire. The captain hoarded supplies, the company cared more for its cargo of silver and spices than for the lives of the men. One night, Jan overheard a heated exchange near the gun deck. "They let us rot," a sailor hissed. "While they feast above, we should take what is ours." "And be hanged for mutiny?" Another spat. "You know the punishment." Still, the words lingered in the air. Mutiny was death, yet hunger had a way of silencing fear. Jan lay awake that night. The toy ship from Peter clutched to his chest, wondering if he too would die nameless in the dark. Visions in the heat, the equator brought not relief, but torment. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the deck into a furnace. Tar bubbled from the seams, the planks grew so hot they blistered bare feet, and the sails drooped in windless despair. Men fainted at their posts, their tongues swollen from thirst. Buckets of water rationed for drinking were guarded like treasure, each gulp a reminder of the sea's cruelty. In the heat, madness crept in. Sailors swore they saw phantom ships on the horizon, shimmering in the haze. Some muttered prayers to saints long forgotten, others cursed God outright. One man, raving with fever, threw himself overboard, shouting that he saw green fields waiting beneath the waves. The sea claimed him without hesitation. John, too, felt the delirium. At night, he dreamt of Amsterdam, the smell of bread from the baker's stall, Peter's laughter echoing through narrow streets. He woke with tears on his cheeks, his body trembling, only to find himself in the same sweltering coffin of wood and salt. A glimmer of hope. After months of torment, a cry broke the monotony. "Land! Land ho!" The men rushed to the rails there, eyes wide with disbelief. Rising from the horizon was the outline of the Cape of Good Hope, a jagged coast where mountains met the sea, a promise of rest and supplies. The Batavia dropped anchor in Table Bay, joining other VOC ships battered by the same trials. Here Jan set foot on land for the first time in months. The earth felt solid beneath his boots, and the smell of grass and fresh fruit nearly made him weep. He devoured oranges until his gums ached, the sour sweetness like medicine against scurvy. Men bathed in rivers, shaved off lice-filled beards, and stumbled through the fields like children rediscovering life. But rest was brief. The company allowed little time for indulgence. The holds were refilled with water, meat, and wine, the sails patched, the wounded left behind. Soon the Batavia lifted anchor once more, turning east toward the vast, treacherous Indian Ocean. Jan's resolve as the coastline of Africa vanished into the mist. Jan stood at the prow, the wooden toy, ship still hidden in his coat. He thought of Peter, of his mother, of the promise he had made. He had survived storms, hunger, and disease. He had watched death walk among the hammocks, claiming friend and stranger alike. But something inside him had hardened. He was no longer the boy who had trembled at the recruiter's tavern. The sea had carved him into something new, scarred, weary, but unbroken. "Come what may," he whispered into the wind, "I will endure." Ahead lay the longest stretch yet, the Indian Ocean, a place sailors called the endless grave. But Jan's eyes, though weary, burned with the stubborn fire of survival. The perilous life of a Dutch VOC sailor had only begun to reveal its darkest truths. Encounters in distant lands. The Indian Ocean was a trial of endurance, but beyond its rolling expanse lay something that filled every sailor with equal parts terror and wonder, the East Indies. The names alone carried the weight of myth. Ceylon, Java, Malacca, Banda, spices that could make a poor man rich, kingdoms filled with strange palaces, jungles crawling with beasts unseen in Europe. For Jan van der Meer, who had known nothing beyond the canals of Amsterdam and the gray waters of the North Sea, the first sight of Asia felt like stepping into another world. The first landfall, Ceylon. After months at sea, the Batavia anchored. Off the island of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, a jewel rising from the ocean, draped in green forests and crowned with mountains. The air itself seemed different, thick, fragrant with cinnamon and cloves, humid as a wet cloth pressed to the face. Jan could hardly believe his senses. Parrots of blinding colors screamed from the trees. The beaches shimmered white, scattered, with shells bigger than his palm. The men, half-starved and sickly, stared in awe at elephants moving in the distance like gray fortresses with tusks of ivory. Yet paradise held its dangers. The company forbade the crew from wandering far inland. The local Kandyan kingdom was not to be trifled with, and rumors told of sailors vanishing in the jungle, their bodies never found. Still, trade commenced. Jan watched wide-eyed as merchants weighed cinnamon bark and nutmeg pods with the care of goldsmiths. Spices were the lifeblood of the VOC, worth their weight in silver back in Amsterdam. One night, Jan and Matthias slipped to the edge of the market, where local fishermen grilled strange fish over coals. The taste was like nothing Jan had ever known. Spiced, sharp, alive with flavor. For a brief moment, he felt almost human again, not just a cog in the company's endless machine. But the illusion shattered when the ship's master spotted them. The lash came swiftly the next morning, each crack across Jan's back a reminder. He was not a guest in these lands, but a servant of the company's greed. Malacca. The crossroads of the East. The Batavia sailed on to Malacca, the great city at the chokehold of the spice trade. Rising from the coast like a crown of stone and timber, Malacca bustled with life unlike anything John had ever seen. The harbor teemed with ships, Chinese junks with dragon-painted prows, Arab dhows with triangular sails, Portuguese carracks still clinging to their empire's fading glory, and now, Dutch men of war staking their claim. Here, Jan's eyes widened at the diversity of humanity. Malays in flowing robes, Chinese traders in silk, Persians with long beards, African slaves dragged in chains, all crammed into narrow streets where the smell of spices, sweat, and incense clashed in the humid air. The VOC had seized Malacca from the Portuguese years before, and its fortresses bristled with cannon. But control came at a cost. The locals despised the Dutch overlords, and whispers of revolt simmered in the taverns. Jan heard stories of ambushes in alleys, poisoned cups of wine, and rival traders eager to slit a sailor's throat for a handful of silver. Jan learned quickly that a VOC sailor walked with eyes always watchful, hand always near the hilt of a knife. In Malacca, opportunity and death lurked side by side. Clash with rivals, the company's enemies were not only hidden in the markets. One morning, as the Batavia prepared to sail, a cry rang out. "Portuguese sails off the starboard bow!" Jan scrambled on deck, his heart thundering. Out on the horizon, white crosses snapped on the sails of enemy ships. The Portuguese, once masters of the East, had not surrendered their pride. The Batavia's cannon roared. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. Splinters flew as iron balls tore into enemy hulls. Muskets cracked from the gunwales, and screams echoed over the waves. Jan, trembling, was handed a musket and ordered to fire. He pulled the trigger, the recoil jarring his shoulder, though he could not tell if he had struck a man or only the... The clash was brief but bloody. The Portuguese retreated, leaving corpses and shattered timbers in their wake. Yet victory tasted bitter. Jan saw sailors dragged below deck with torn limbs, blood soaking the planks. He had thought death by storm was merciless, but death in battle was worse, because here men chose to kill. That night, Jan could not sleep. The faces of the dying haunted him, Portuguese and Dutch alike. For the first time, he wondered if spices and silver were worth so much blood. The Spice Islands weeks later, the Batavia reached the heart of the VOC's empire, the Banda Islands. To Europe, the word nutmeg meant wealth. To the Bandanese, it meant slaughter. Jan had heard whispers among the sailors, But nothing prepared him for the truth. The VOC had seized the islands with brutal force. Villages had been burned, thousands killed or enslaved, survivors forced to work nutmeg groves under the watch of Dutch soldiers. When Jan stepped ashore, the land smelled of nutmeg so strong it clung to his skin. But the air was heavy with silence, broken only by the crack of whips and the cries of workers in the fields. Matthias muttered under his breath, "This is no paradise. This is a graveyard." Jan said nothing, but the shame burned in him. He was beginning to see what the company truly was. Not a noble venture of trade, but an empire of cruelty built on the backs of the broken. A temptation of fortune. And yet fortune glittered even in blood. In Batavia, modern Jakarta, the VOC's Asian headquarters, Jan saw wealth beyond imagination. The streets bustled with merchants counting silver coins, warehouses stacked high with nutmeg, pepper, and cloves. Officers dined on fine meats and wines, while sailors, if they survived long enough, could earn more in one voyage than in a lifetime at home. It was here that Jan faced a choice. Matthias urged him to stash away coins, to gamble, to scheme for a quicker fortune. "One chest of silver, Jan," he whispered. "One chest, and you never go hungry again." But Klaus, the quiet boy, shook his head. "Fortune is a lie. Look around. Half the men who came with us are gone. The sea and the company will take the rest. Silver won't keep you from the rope." Jan felt torn between hunger for wealth and horror at what it cost. He carried Peter's toy ship in his coat, a reminder of home, of the promise he had made. Was survival enough? Or must a man claim more, even if it meant blood on his hands? Jan's awakening one evening in Batavia. Jan wandered to the edge of the harbor. Lanterns glowed along the water, casting trembling reflections. Native children laughed as they chased each other along the shore, their voices innocent, untouched by the cruelty of the VOC. Jan realized then that the world was far greater than he had ever dreamed. Larger than Amsterdam, larger than the company, larger even than the endless sea. He was a small man in a vast and merciless machine, but he still carried the fire of choice. He clenched the toy ship in his hand. "I will not be like them," he whispered. "I will not lose myself." The East had changed him. The sea had broken his body, but Asia was shaping his soul. Ahead lay more battles, more storms, more temptation. But Jan knew he had crossed another threshold. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a witness, and that perhaps was more dangerous than anything else. The weight of war and greed. The year had turned, though Jan could not tell which day or month it was anymore. At sea, time dissolved into endless watches and tolling bells, and on land, the company demanded obedience without pause. He had thought storms, hunger, and scurvy were the greatest torments a man could endure. But here, in the East, Jan discovered the truth. The sea broke men's bodies, but greed broke their souls. War in the Moluccas, the Batavia's orders were clear. Sail to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and enforce the company's monopoly. The Dutch Republic had decreed that nutmeg and cloves would be theirs alone, and no rival power, Portuguese, English, or native, would stand in the way. When John first stepped ashore on a small island near Ambon, the air was thick with the sweet, choking scent of cloves. The trees grew like guardians, their branches heavy with spice worth more than gold. But the beauty of the land was drowned by the violence that followed. The VOC officers commanded the sailors and soldiers alike to raid villages suspected of selling cloves to rival traders. Fires rose into the night sky, the screams of families, echoing as huts burned. Men were slaughtered, women and children dragged into chains. Jan's musket shook in his hands. He had been ordered to stand guard while officers torched a cluster of huts. A boy no older than Peter ran toward him, eyes wide with terror. John froze. The boy's bare feet slapped against the dirt. Behind him, a Dutch officer raised his pistol. The shot rang out. The boy fell before Jan could even breathe. His small body sprawled in the dirt, his eyes glassy, the smell of gunpowder mingling with spice and smoke. Jan vomited into the earth, his chest heaving. Around him, sailors carried on as if nothing had happened. That night, Jan lay awake. The toy ship pressed to his chest. He thought of Peter, of the boy's eyes, and realized that the company did not simply kill men. It taught others to stop seeing them as human. The greed of officers. The officers lived like kings, while the sailors starved. In Ambon, the governor's house blazed with candlelight, tables groaning with roasted meat, fine wine, and silks imported from China. The same men who forced sailors to eat worm-ridden bread dined on golden plates and laughed as slaves fanned them with palm leaves. Jan and Matthias were sent to carry barrels of nutmeg into the governor's storerooms. As they sweated beneath the weight, Jan heard the governor chuckle to another officer. "Each barrel here buys another house in Amsterdam," the man said. "And what do the sailors get? Worms and rope." Matthias spat onto the ground. "If I live long enough to return home, I'll burn my contract before I sign another," he whispered. But Jan said nothing. He felt a slow-burning rage coil within him, not only at the officers, but at himself. Hadn't he signed that contract willingly? Hadn't he thought of silver and fortune just as they did? The greed of the company was not distant. It was inside every man who chose survival over justice. A pirate attack greed invited not only war, but piracy. In the Java Sea, the Batavia was set upon by a flotilla of Malay pirates, their swift proas slicing through the waves with sails painted black. They came at dawn, screaming war cries, their decks bristling with spears and curved blades. The Batavia's cannon thundered, but the pirates were quick, darting close enough for grappling hooks to bite into the wood. Jan found himself in the thick of the fight, musket in hand, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. A pirate leapt aboard, his kriss dagger flashing. Jan barely raised his musket before the man's blade slashed across his arm. Pain seared through him, and instinct drove him to swing the musket like a club, cracking the man's skull. The pirate collapsed, blood pooling at Jan's feet. For a heartbeat, Jan froze, staring at the lifeless body. He had killed before, in battle against the Portuguese, but this was different. Here, it was face to face. His survival, bought with another man's death. When the fight ended, the Batavia was bloodied but afloat. The pirates drifted away, leaving corpses tangled in the waves. The sailors cheered their survival, but Jan did not join. He washed the blood from his hands and wondered how much of himself had already been lost to the sea. The price of silverback in Batavia, Jan witnessed a punishment so cruel it etched itself into his bones. A sailor had stolen silver coins from the company's warehouse, a handful, no more. The governor decreed death, not by rope, but by breaking wheel. Jan was forced to watch as the man's limbs were shattered one by one beneath iron bars, his screams rising into the hot air. The officers stood in silence, their faces unmoved. The sailors looked on, some with fear, others with dull acceptance. When it was over, the man's body was left on display outside the fortress, a warning to all. The company valued silver more than human flesh. That night, Jan could not eat. The toy ship felt heavier than ever in his pocket, as though Peter's eyes accused him of complicity. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to escape. But where could he go? The sea was endless, the company everywhere, seeds of rebellion among. The sailors' whispers grew louder. Matthias, still fierce despite his bleeding gums and worn body, began to speak of rebellion. "They treat us like dogs," he hissed one night. "But dogs bite back. What if we took a ship of our own? What if we sailed for freedom? Some men laughed at the madness. Others listened, their eyes glinting with desperation. Jan listened, too, torn between fear and hope. Freedom sounded sweet, but he had seen what happened to mutineers. The noose, the lash, the wheel. The company had endless ways of crushing those who dared defy it. Yet the seed had been planted. In his heart, Jan began to wonder if survival alone was enough. Jan's breaking point one evening, as the sun bled. Red into the horizon, Jan stood alone on the deck. The sea stretched before him, calm and endless, hiding countless graves. He thought of the boy in Ambon, of the pirate he had killed, of the man broken on the wheel. He pulled Peter's toy ship from his pocket and stared at it. The small piece of wood carved with care was the last reminder of innocence he carried. In it lay a promise to return, to survive, to remain himself. But could he? Could any man serve the company and still keep his soul? Jan clenched the toy so hard the edges dug into his palm. The fire that had carried him through storms now burned darker, sharper. He was no longer just a sailor. He was a man standing at the edge of a choice: endure the company's cruelty forever or risk everything for something greater. The sea whispered no answers, only its eternal roar, the price of fortune. The rains had come to Batavia, and with them a heat so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. The streets turned into rivers of mud, the canals into choking swamps, and the air into a haze of rot and disease. Flies swarmed everywhere, over garbage heaps, over corpses of slaves left too long in the sun, even over the barrels of nutmeg stacked in the company's warehouses. For Jan van der Meer, Batavia had become a prison more suffocating than the Batavia itself. He had survived storms, scurvy, pirates, and the company's merciless punishments. But now the temptation of wealth and escape pressed on him with an unbearable weight. Silver in the shadows one evening, Matthias grabbed Jan's arm and pulled him into a narrow alley. The rain dripped from broken tiles above as Matthias whispered, eyes darting. "There's a shipment," he said, "a small chest bound for Amsterdam, silver coins, enough to buy freedom, enough to leave this cursed company behind." Jan's heart pounded. He thought of Peter, of his mother bent over, laundry tubs. With silver, he could return home not as a pauper, but as a man of means. He could buy bread, a roof, dignity. But he also thought of the man broken on the wheel for stealing less than that. He remembered the boy shot in Ambon. Could he risk becoming another corpse on display? Matthias grinned, fierce and reckless. "Are you with me, Jan? Or will you rot like the rest?" Jan said nothing, but his silence was enough. Matthias's eyes lit with wild fire. The seed of betrayal had been sown. The silent deals of Batavia in Batavia, everything had a price. Sailors sold company muskets to smugglers in exchange for rice wine. Soldiers took bribes to look the other way as English merchants slipped nutmeg past the VOC guards. Even officers, the men who preached loyalty and obedience, filled their own purses with secret deals. Jan saw it all, and the hypocrisy curdled in his gut. The lash and the rope were meant only for men like him, common sailors without power. The rich lived fat on greed, and the poor died for scraps. One night, he followed Klaas, the quiet boy, and discovered his secret. Klaas had been selling stolen spices to local traders, hiding the coins in a loose plank beneath his hammock. When Jan confronted him, Klaas's face twisted in fear. "If you tell," Klaas whispered, "I'm a dead man. Please, Jan." Jan's lips tightened. He should have reported it. He should have obeyed. But when Klaas pulled out a coin and pressed it into Jan's hand, cold and heavy, Jan felt the sickness of temptation. He did not refuse. The price of friendship Matthias's plan soon came to life. He convinced Jan and a few others to steal from the company's storeroom. The chest of silver was smaller than Jan had imagined, yet so heavy 2 men struggled to lift it. They hid it in barrels of grain, planning to sneak it aboard a smaller vessel bound for the coast. But fortune is cruel. An informer among them betrayed the plot. The company's guards burst in before dawn, dragging Matthias and the others into the courtyard. Jan was spared. No one had spoken his name. But he watched in horror as Matthias was flogged until his back was raw, then chained in irons. The governor sentenced him to labor in the nutmeg fields, a death slower than the rope. Matthias's eyes found Jan's as he was dragged away. For a heartbeat, Jan thought he saw betrayal there, a flicker of accusation. Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you share my fate? That night, Jan wept for the first time since leaving Amsterdam. The temptation of power. The company was not only silver and spices, it was power. Some sailors rose by pleasing their officers, trading their dignity for advancement. One such man was Cornelis, a sharp-eyed sailor who had begun as lowly as Jan, but now strutted with the favor of a lieutenant. Cornelis whispered poison into men's ears. Obey, and you'll rise. Defy, and you'll die. Better to be master than victim. Jan despised him, yet part of him envied the way Cornelis stood above lashings and rations. Cornelis no longer slept in hammocks among the stench. He dined at officers' tables, his hands clean of rope and tar. Was this the true price of survival? To surrender one's soul piece by piece until nothing remained but greed and ambition? The betrayal. One humid night, Jan woke to shouts. Klaas, the quiet boy, had been discovered. His hidden hoard of silver coins was dragged out before the crew. The officers wasted no time. Klaas was tied to the mast, his thin frame trembling. Thief! The captain spat. The lash tore into Klaas's back until his skin hung in strips. He did not cry out, only clenched his jaw until blood ran from his lips. When it was over, he was cast ashore, abandoned to die in the alleys of Batavia. Jan could not sleep. He had taken Klaas's coin, and now the weight of it burned in his pocket like fire. He wanted to throw it into the sea, yet could not let it go. That was the cruelest truth of fortune. Once it touched your hands, it poisoned you forever. The illusion of return. Jan sometimes dreamt of Amsterdam. In his dreams, Peter stood waiting, at the docks, smiling, the wooden toy ship in his hand. His mother embraced him, tears of joy streaking her face as Jan poured silver coins into her palms. But when he woke, the reality crushed him. How many men had ever returned? Half of those who sailed east never made it home, and those who did often returned broken, missing limbs, coughing blood, or haunted by memories that silenced them in the taverns. Would Jan ever see Peter again? Or would his bones rot in some foreign land, his name forgotten? Jan's choice won. Evening, standing alone at the harbor, Jan stared at the ships preparing to sail back to the Netherlands. He held Peter's toy ship in his hand, its edges worn smooth. He could try to desert, to hide aboard a returning vessel. He could risk everything for a chance at freedom. But if caught, he would be hanged without mercy. Behind him, Batavia buzzed, with laughter, trade, and cruelty. Ahead lay the sea, the same sea that had beaten him, scarred him, but also taught him resilience. Jan whispered to himself, I will not let the company own me, not my soul, not forever. It was not yet rebellion. It was not yet freedom, but it was the spark of defiance, the first ember of a fire that could not be extinguished. The homecoming, or oblivion. The sails of the Batavia strained in the wind as the ship prepared for the homeward voyage. The holds were packed tight with treasure, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, pepper, and silver coins bound for Amsterdam. The officers congratulated themselves, boasting of profits that would make them legends. The sailors said nothing. They knew the truth. Half the men who left never returned. For Jan van der Meer, the return journey was not a promise, but a final trial. He had survived storms, battles, disease, and the cruelty of the VOC. But home was still an ocean away, and the sea was a merciless judge. The long road back. The voyage westward began with silence. The Indian Ocean stretched wide, the days measured by the slant of the sun and the groaning of the timbers. The ship's pace slowed as men's bodies, already weakened, began to fail. Scurvy returned with vengeance. Gums bled, teeth fell, legs swelled like rotten logs. The stench below deck grew unbearable, a mix of sweat, blood, and decay. Jan lost count of the dead tossed into the sea. Each splash echoed in his chest like a tolling bell. But death was not the only threat. Tempers frayed. Men whispered of mutiny, of killing the officers and seizing the silver for themselves. Jan felt the pull of that temptation, just as he had in Batavia. But he remembered Matthias's broken body, Klaas's bleeding back, and the boy in Ambon. He knew how rebellion ended, with corpses and rope. So he kept silent, clinging to Peter's wooden toy ship, as if it were an anchor for his soul. The ghost of Matthias one night, as Jan stood on deck, the sea calm under the stars, he thought he heard a voice. "Why didn't you follow me?" He turned, heart pounding. No one was there, only the wind in the rigging, the slap of water against the hull. But in his mind's eye he saw Matthias, chains around his wrists, eyes burning with betrayal. "You chose survival over brotherhood," the ghost whispered. Jan closed his eyes, gripping the toy ship until it dug into his flesh. Was Matthias right? Had he already betrayed everything by living while others died? Survival carried its own guilt, heavier than chains. Shipwreck weeks later, disaster struck. Off the coast of Africa, a storm rose like none before. Waves towered higher than the masts, black as mountains, their crests white with fury. The Batavia groaned, its timbers screaming as water poured over the deck. "Pump the bilge! Reef the sails!" the officers shouted, but their voices were swallowed by the roar. Jan clung to the rigging, rain blinding him, as men were swept into the sea like rag dolls. The storm raged for hours, tearing sails, snapping ropes, battering the ship, until it seemed certain to break. In the chaos, a mast splintered with a sound like thunder. It crashed across the deck, crushing men beneath its weight. Jan's heart froze. Death was everywhere, screaming, howling, roaring. He prayed, not for riches, not for fortune, but for one thing only. Let me see home again. Let me keep my promise to Peter. By dawn, the storm passed. The Batavia floated still, though battered and leaking. Dozens were gone, their bodies now food for sharks. The survivors stared at the wreckage in silence, hollow-eyed, their souls as scarred as the ship. The Cape of Good Hope. Again at last, the ship limped into Table Bay at the Cape of Good Hope. Men staggered onto land, some falling to their knees and kissing the soil. Fresh fruit and meat were brought aboard, but the relief was sharp and fleeting. The officers reminded them Amsterdam was still far, and fortune belonged only to those who survived the final stretch. Jan walked alone along the rocky shore. The wind smelled of grass, of earth, of life. He thought of staying, deserting the VOC forever, building a life among strangers. But he knew the company's reach stretched even here, and beyond all temptation, one voice pulled him still. "Peters." "I will come back," Jan whispered, "even if it kills me." The final passage, the Atlantic was no gentler than the Indian Ocean. Storms battered the Batavia, and fever swept the decks. Yet slowly, painfully, the miles fell away. The men grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their voices weak. Even Cornelis, who had strutted so proudly, now lay coughing in the sick bay, his power crumbling with his body. Jan endured. He had become something beyond a sailor, something forged of storms and suffering, tempered by fire and grief. He was no longer the boy who had signed a contract in a candlelit tavern. He was something harder, but also something lonelier. Homecoming at last, after nearly 3 years, the cry came, "Land! Land ho!" Amsterdam rose from the horizon like a dream. The spires of churches, the red roofs, the familiar stink of canals, all blurred before Jan's eyes as tears he had long buried finally broke free. The ship docked. Merchants rushed aboard, tallying the cargo. Officers marched with pride, silver clinking in their purses. Families wept as they embraced the few sailors who stumbled ashore. Jan stood on the wharf, his legs trembling on solid ground. He clutched Peter's toy ship, worn smooth from years of salt and sweat. And then, there he was. Peter, no longer a boy but a youth, his eyes wide with disbelief. Their mother stood beside him, her back still bent, her face lined with years. "Of worry. John," she whispered, as though afraid he might vanish. John dropped to his knees, pulling Peter into his arms. He pressed the toy ship into his brother's hand. "I kept it," he choked. "I promised I'd come back." For a moment, the years of torment, the screams, the storms, all faded. For a moment, there was only home, the shadow of the sea yet. Even in that embrace, Jan knew the truth. He was not the same. The sea had carved scars into his soul that no coin, no homecoming could erase. He had seen the cruelty of men, the greed of empire, the fragility of life. As the sun set over Amsterdam, Jan stared out at the masts rising in the harbor. New ships were preparing to sail east, filled with fresh faces eager for fortune. He wanted to cry out, to warn them, but he knew they would not listen. Hunger drowned caution, just as it once had in him. John Vandermeer had survived, but the sea never truly released those it claimed. In his dreams, storms still raged, cannons still thundered, and Matthias's eyes still burned with betrayal. The sea had given him homecoming, but it had taken his innocence forever.